Thank you very much for inviting me, and congratulations to all of you for spending a Sunday afternoon talking about these serious subjects, and for all turning out for this great economic summit. What I want to share with you in about 20 minutes, and then we'll have 10 minutes for Q&A, is some thoughts as to why globalization needs to be improved and what we can do about it. And I'm going to draw on two books that I've recently done. One is Divided Nations, and the other is Globalization for Development, Meeting New Challenges. And I'll be outside afterwards and happy to sign copies and talk to you about those in greater detail. The reason that I work on globalization is because I believe it is the most powerful force in human history to bring progress to the world. It is potentially the source of enormous progress. All of our lives are better than our parents' generations, and this force has brought more people out of poverty than any in human history. Average life expectancy has increased by about 20 years since the Berlin Wall came down. That's more rapid than it took from the Stone Age to the 1970s to get an average improvement in human history. And there are lots of other indicators you can look at. So this period, your lives, the time that many of you have been alive, the last 20 years or so, has been quite remarkable. And there's a real prospect that in your lifetimes, extraordinary things happen. There's no reason why poverty should not be eliminated in your lifetimes. There's no reason why many of the chronic diseases that afflict people, like cancer, don't get eliminated. And there's no reason why you shouldn't live well into your hundreds free of worries about Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, and dementia that I'm pretty worried about. So that's the opportunity. It's the most extraordinary opportunity that the world has ever known. But I worry that it won't happen. I worry that the potential not only will not be realized, but actually we could be set back. This could be our best century ever in the history of humanity, but equally, it could be our worst. It could be characterized by levels of destruction, not only of humanity, but of the planet, which also are unprecedented. It could be characterized by wars, by conflicts, by famines, and by massive climate change, which leads to the collapse of biodiversity and many of the systems that we know are necessary to sustain us. The choice is ours. The choice is ours as we take the high road or the low road. And the reason I worry particularly is because although we've become much more joined up, and by globalization I mean integration, I mean the coming down of barriers, I mean connectivity. That's what I mean by globalization. The ability of people in different countries and within countries to experience things in new ways because the walls have come down, because doors have been opened. But this same force requires increasing collective responsibility. It requires the ability to manage collectively. It requires the ability for nations to work in harmony together. And when you look around the world, there's very little evidence that globalization of the real economy, of our financial system, of the things that we know about, the internet and everything else, has been in any way associated with progress in politics and progress in coordination. Indeed, the title of the book, Divided Nations, is about this failure. Nations are as divided as they have ever been. Indeed, many would say they are more so. We live in this Westphalian system where nations still think, and people still think, that they can manage the world as if we all in our little islands. But we know that everything that is going to shape our lives is going to come from over there. It's going to come from across our borders. It's going to come from globally joined up connectivity. In Divided Nations, I look at 5 examples of how the new forces which shape our world require a different form of coordination. I look at finance, I look at cybersecurity, I look at migration, I look at pandemics, and I look at climate change. And what's obvious is that all of these cannot be managed at the national level. Of course, what we do nationally will determine the outcomes, but they require coordination. Finance is interesting because, as you know, it's the most sophisticated of the global systems. It is actually the most joined up system. The financial system at the national level is the most sophisticated. So in the UK, for example, the Treasury and the Bank of England is the most sophisticated of the UK's government management capabilities. It has the best people. It also has the best data. And of course, because it prints the money, it has the most resources. And this is true at the global level as well, where institutions like the IMF and the BIS, the World Bank, and the other global institutions of finance are the best of the global system. They're far better than the UN and other counterparts. So how was it that this system, which is so data-rich, which is so people-rich, which is so well-connected, where everyone knows everyone else, we all play golf together at Jackson Hole once a year, how is it that it totally failed to see the financial crisis and still hasn't worked out how to resolve it? And the answer is that the level of technological and systemic change embedded in the system leaped ahead of the institutional capabilities to manage it at the national and at the global level. We had national regulators, they were operating as if they had a financial system of the 1980s in the 2000s. Complacent, politically captured, lobbied to remove regulations, and unable to have the levers or even to know what levers they should have. And so we had this total failure. And if you read the evidence of Hank Paulson to the Congressional Committee into the collapse of the financial crisis, you remember he'd been the chief executive of Goldman Sachs. So many of us were concerned that there were conflicts of interest between the chief executive of Goldman Sachs also becoming the Treasury Secretary. But we thought that there was one silver lining, which is that he'd understand banking. You read his evidence and he simply says, we did not know what was happening. That's why we let Lehman go. And that's why we triggered a global financial collapse. Lack of comprehension. So if the best of the systems has absolutely failed to keep pace with change, what more for the systems where there is no system? Cyber has no global management. Cyber is an anarchic system. Cyber is a race between the good guys and the bad guys. My former colleague, Jonathan Zittrain, has written a book called The End of the Internet, which is about this, and the inability of the system, which is not governed in any way, to keep pace with the threats posed to it, both of a structural and other nature. Now, of course, we also worry about what management would be put in place, and we see in the whole Snowden escapades the sorts of threats that can be posed to our privacy and to everything else. But this requires deep debate about what we want for joined-up systems and how we manage them and how we keep them robust in a way that will advance our interests as citizens. That doesn't exist anywhere. There is no conversation on cyber of any substantive nature amongst governments, except for security. Pandemics is another example because pandemics, of course, are about connectivity and density. The more of us, the more connected we are, the closer we are together, the bigger the threat. We've just been incredibly lucky. Our group in Oxford, it's in the Oxford Martin School, which I direct, has modeled that everything can travel everywhere within 48 hours. And the big sources of our connectivity, like the Heathrows and JFKs and O'Hare's, other airports, become the vectors of super spreading of the great dangers that get propagated. Again, no global system to speak of, which is commensurate with the challenge. Migration, an orphan of the system. No global institution on migration. There's the International Organization for Migration. It's a voluntary organization which many countries are not members of. It has no jurisdiction. It has no jurisprudence. It cannot manage. And so we see in this the bullying of weak countries and of weak people by big countries and strong people. And of course, climate change is the last example that I cite. And that is a dramatic example of where individual rational action in a hyper-globalized world leads to destabilizing outcomes. And what's so interesting about all of these examples, and I could give you many others, like antibiotics, for example, is that about rational individual action not summing to collectively rational outcomes. If we all take our antibiotics, that's a good thing for us. Unfortunately, the more we do it, the less effective they all come to be. And so, like the examples of other global commons tragedies, the fish in the oceans and many others, climate change will be an example where all of our rational actions, get more power, put the heating on, get air conditioning, and as people climb the curve out of poverty from about $2,000 to $10,000 per capita, 3.8 billion people over the next 15 years or so will maximize the transformation of their income into energy, into fossil fuel consumption, into carbon emissions. And of course, it's right for each of them. And it's even right for the countries to allow their citizens to do this. It would be ethically, politically impossible to say, sorry, you cannot climb the energy ladder. But when everyone does it, the planet will frazzle. So how do we manage these processes of individual rationality, often national rationality, and collective failure is what Divided Nations is about. In Globalization for Development, I talk about the potential of globalization to be an immense force for good, but also for harm. And every dimension we look at of globalization, the flows across borders, and because it's an economic summit, let's focus on the economic flows, finance, trade, aid, and the most powerful, the bundling of ideas with this. Each of these can be used to take people out of poverty, to give people better lives, but they can equally be used to destroy lives and create growing instability. And what we've seen with globalization, unfortunately, is that it has been associated with growing inequality within countries and between countries everywhere, with one or two notable exceptions where there's been massive attempts to correct this, like Brazil, which started, of course, from one of the worst bases of very high levels of inequality. So are we doomed, as we become more and more connected, to suffer a more and more unequal world where the spillover effects become more and more intense, and then people push back? They don't like it. It's not surprising that the 60% youth unemployed in the south of Europe don't like globalization, say it has not delivered for them. It is not surprising that in the UK, UKIP got 24% of the vote in the recent election, capturing the fears of people who fear that more connectivity and more openness does not lead to progress. It actually leads to destabilizing threats. When we open our doors, wonderful things come through, but really bad stuff comes through too. Terrorists, pandemics, financial crises, and other things we don't like. So let's slam the doors closed. Let's build higher walls around our societies. Let's become more protectionist, xenophobic, and nationalist is the response. And you can understand why people feel that way. Because globalization does pose threats. It does lead to growing inequality, and it can bring instability. Well, I believe passionately that globalization is a force for good, and that we need to manage it more effectively. Unless we consciously manage it, it will serve those interests of those that want to become more inward-looking and closed. And this would be disastrous. It would be particularly disastrous for poor people, because we've seen the evidence that it provides jobs and employment around the world. It would also be disastrous for the UK. The UK's future, as all societies' futures, depend on more integration and more connectivity, not less. And you cannot manage the threats by putting up higher barriers. You would not stop the financial crisis. You would not stop a pandemic. And you would not stop a cyber attack. And you certainly won't stop climate change by trying to do things on your own. You can only stop these threats and manage them by being more connected. And so what divided nations and globalization for development try and do is think about how this would happen. Now, part of the problem with the institutional setup is that it is the result of a power handover, and this is a good thing. The US used to think it could run the world, and it certainly still thinks it can run some global institutions, like the World Bank. The rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and other nations, has led to a power transition. This power transition is likely to lead to a much healthier place in global governance, where there's a real shared ownership and management of global institutions. The problem is that that process is going to take 10 or 20 years. And so in the power vacuum that exists at the moment, there's a real drift. No one can get the UN to work. And we see this in Syria with great tragedy today. No one can get the World Bank to be as effective as it could be. There are very few effective institutions in global governance. Many of them are drifting. Many of them have been captured by small political interests. And very few of them have been able to recreate themselves, regenerate the necessary skills for a new world. So in this time of transition, we need to think in new ways. And what I propose is very related to work that the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations has brought out, and I encourage you to look at the website of the Commission. The report is called Now for the Long Term. And amongst the proposals are proposals which are in divided nations as well, about creative coalitions. We need to move away from the monopoly of governments, and particularly the monopoly of international governance, because the system is gridlocked. If you leave it to the system, you will not get the necessary management of global affairs that is so vital. What do coalitions mean? They mean that we all need to find ways, through various different types of institutions, through a variable geometry, of contributing to the resolution of these issues. Countries that will move need to move. They should not wait for unanimity in the international system. Corporates, which now actually account for, in something like climate change, the overwhelming majority of emissions, need to move and be compelled to move by consumer pressure. And cities, where over 60% of the world's population now live, and where 70% of carbon emissions, for example, originate, cities can move without waiting for governments. So the creation of coalitions of actors that actually can affect outcomes becomes absolutely critical. If one waits for national governments or international governance, one is going to wait too long. And the problems, of course, ratchet up. Certainly a problem like climate change ratchets up. It doesn't wait for resolution. So we need to stop using the international system as an excuse for inaction, which is what tends to happen. We kick things up to the UN, we know the UN is incapable. We kick things up to our national governments, but we know our national governments on things that we care desperately about might not do things. Of course, in democracies, there's a process by which you can ensure that your governments, in the end, reflect the people's interests. But this is not everywhere, and it's a very slow process. And as Joe Stiglitz has shown in his book, The Price of Inequality, as societies become more unequal, the potential for mobilizing becomes more and more difficult because there's capture. Lobby groups and others capture governments, and therefore change becomes more difficult. So in Divided Nations, I talk about practical measures Individuals have been empowered by globalization, and they've been empowered by the new technologies. Indeed, for better and also for worse, individuals have never been more powerful. Individuals can bring down big banks like like Barings, like the whale trader, and others. But they can also create massive transformational change. And I've seen that in my lifetime with the experience of someone like President Mandela. The ability of individuals to mobilize and to change for good and worse. One of the things that individuals can also do now, which is new, is that they can kill hundreds of millions of people with new biopathogens, using little DNA toolkits to build a smallpox, Ebola, or something worse. So we need to think a lot about cohesiveness of societies and how individuals can play different roles, and how through education and connectivity we can get coalitions of like-minded individuals to move where governments might not always move. So my hope is that in thinking about these issues, you keep your feet firmly rooted in the economic and other realities. But remember that there's a tension between individual rationality and collective outcomes. What's good for us as individuals as we get wealthier and wealthier and freer is not necessarily good for society. When we do the right thing as an individual, we are not necessarily doing the right thing for an individual society. And individual societies, as they do the right thing, are not necessarily doing the right thing for the world. And climate change and climbing the energy ladder is a very good example of that. So how does one reconcile these? How does one think about the relationship between them, and how does one manage in a hyper-globalized world of the 21st century? Those are the topics I believe are absolutely central to us being able to navigate the coming years. Thank you. So I think that was about 20 minutes, was it? So we have 10 minutes for Q&A. Who'd like to go first? Someone back there?
Thank you very much, Mr. Goldin. What are the implications of what you're saying for the independence of small countries like Catalonia, for example? Do you think this is positive as a way to empower communities? Or do you think this is negative, as in more governments getting in the way of global governance?
Yeah, one of the remarkable features of the past 100 years, but it's accelerated over the past 50 years or so, has been the proliferation of countries. It's about doubled the number of countries over the last 100 years. Some of this is very good things, like the breakup of the Soviet Union, for example. And there are very few processes which buck the trend. The European Union is the only real example of countries voluntarily giving up some sovereignty. And that's obviously a whole discussion in itself, but I'm very in favor of it. So there is definitely a proliferation of countries. I think it has made global governance much more difficult. An international negotiation of 20 people, like happened at the end of the Second World War to create a lot of the architecture that we see today, and it was all men, literally in cigar smoke-filled rooms, that basically sorted out the world. That is impossible to imagine now. Now, in the latest conference on climate change, you had something like 25,000 people participating. Countries, but then NGOs, corporates, and many other actors, all often in real time with Twitter feeds and things through social media. How can one possibly get global agreement with that level of complexity and engagement? And also accountability to very wide-ranging audiences. So I think there is a real tension. I think that we do need to form constituency-based global politics. So for example, on climate change, 20 countries account for something like 85 or 90% of global emissions. Why do we need the whole world to come to an agreement to stop emissions? Of course, the question of legitimacy is important, and we learned from Iraq that coalitions of the willing are not always a good idea. How do you prove that a coalition of these countries would not be acting only in their self-interest? You get Bangladesh, the Maldives, and some other affected parties to sign off. But I'd be very willing to sign off, personally, on an agreement reached by 85% of the emitters with a small group of countries most dramatically affected by climate change, like a Bangladesh or Maldives. I think it passes the legitimacy test. I think we're going to have to give up some sovereignty if we want many more countries. So in some ways, local is wonderful, small countries are wonderful, but they're not a substitute, and they make global governance more complicated. So giving up and allowing groups of countries to represent you, I think, becomes extremely important. Why don't you go backwards and then come forwards? Oh, right, that's fine. The woman over here.
Thank you for your speech. Towards the end, you mentioned the fact that institutions, big institutions, are failing to get people to talk together, and you gave the example of Syria and the UN. So some people may argue that these institutions are just a waste of a lot of resources and time. What would you say? What's your opinion on that?
I think they are losing legitimacy, but I don't think they're a waste. If the UN Charter is the most beautiful document in the world, we the people is the right aspiration, and having that sort of forum for nations to speak to each other, I think, is the right sort of aspiration. They really have to be made more effective by renewal. One of the things that I believe very strongly in is that there needs to be a sunset clause attached to the life of institutions. In other words, there should be a compulsory evaluation of their relevance and renewal of their staff. The problem is they become like civil servants. People think they have a right to a permanent job. They think that their mandate should be not changed, etc. That's, I believe, wrong. The issues change, the people need to change, their skills need to change. One of the things the financial crisis really demonstrated was these people didn't know what was going on. They didn't have the right skills. So renewal of international institutions and compulsory renewal doesn't mean you have to close them down. It means you have to ask the question, are they relevant and how do you make them more relevant? They are in the end paid for by taxpayers' money. They need to be accountable to us. So I believe radical reform, not closure, is the answer. And of course there are big gaps, like on migration and others, where I believe we need new institutions. Cyber is another one. I'll leave it to you to choose this lady over here, people up there. Okay, there's only time for one more question, I'm afraid. I'll be outside afterwards if you want to grab me.
How do you ensure that globalization doesn't become hegemonization of the West, both economically and culturally?
Yeah. There's no evidence that globalization has been associated with homogenization or hegemonization. In many respects, one of the big surprises has been how it's allowed a multiplicity of different cultures, languages, fashions, whatever, to thrive in very interesting new ways. And some communities, like for example the Armenian community, which was almost non-existent, has rediscovered itself through globalization. So now there's a very thriving global Armenian community. And this is true of many, many different cultures and many things. And in interesting ways. So hip-hop dancing has taken off in Shanghai, inspired by a new global community around that. And it's happening in science, it's happening in other areas. So it has not, the French were terrified that everyone would be eating McDonald's and wearing jeans, Levi's. If you go to France, there's never been a healthier time for French culture and products and services, partly because there's global demand for them now, coming out of globalization. And they're spreading to many places that they didn't exist before. So I don't see on the cultural or religious or other fronts that there's any evidence about homogenization or hegemony. The economic issues are important, but actually what we've also seen with globalization is that world power is more distributed now than it's been at any point in history of the last 100+ years. There's a better distribution, and it's moving further that way. China will become the biggest economy again. like it was hundreds of years ago, and there'd be all sorts of other new players. So it's difficult to argue, as some argued in the 1960s or 70s, that basically globalization was a US agenda and all it would do would reinforce US power around the world. I don't think the evidence points to that at all. I'm afraid I've been told to stop at this point. I will be outside if you want to buy the books or have a chat.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Goldin.
Thank you.